Hey, everybody, this is Dave with a quick interruption before we start today's episode. This is episode 200. Just wanted to say thanks for listening for so long. Thanks for sticking with us, and we hope to continue this relationship for a long time to come. So here we go with episode 200, defending Boston having never made a bad album. I'm going to make a claim that some Boston fans may not agree with. Boston never made a bad album. Yes, I'm including Corporate America and Life, Love, and Hope. Not perfect albums, not equal albums, but not bad albums. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Dave's Side 1. I'm Dave, your host, who believes an album can fall short of a masterpiece without becoming a failure. Over here at Art of Listening Records, where every record has a story, and every story starts on side 1. Today I am defending the entire Boston studio catalog, all 6 albums, because while some are clearly stronger than others, I do not believe Boston ever released a truly bad studio record. The problem begins with the first album. It defined the band, more than a feeling, peace of mind, foreplay and long time, rock and roll band, smokin', hitch a ride. That is not a normal debut album track list. It gave listeners the guitars, the harmonies, Brad Delp's voice, Tom Scholz's production, and a sound that seemed fully developed from the first song. Every Boston album that followed would be compared with that record, and almost every album by almost any band would lose that comparison. Now, before we go any further, let me explain what I mean. I'm not saying that all 6 Boston albums deserve the same rating. They don't. I'm not saying every song works. They don't. And I'm definitely not saying the later records had the same cultural impact as the first 2. They did not. I'm saying that every Boston studio album gives me enough strong songwriting, musicianship, and recognizable Boston character to justify its existence. Every one has at least one song that belongs in the conversation. Most have several. That's a much more reasonable definition of a catalog without a bad album. The debut is the most obvious starting point. It's not merely Boston's best-known album. It's one of those rare records that feels like a greatest hits collection before the band has even had time to make a second album. Then came Don't Look Back. It may not have surprised listeners the way the debut did, but the title track, A Man I'll Never Be, Feelin' Satisfied, and Used to Bad News, showed that the Boston sound was not limited to one record. The album feels shorter and in places less fully developed. But bad? Not even close. 8 years later, Third Stage arrived. Amanda became Boston's biggest pop single. We're Ready, Cool the Engines, and Can't You Say proved the guitars and harmonies were still there. The album is more reflective than the first 2. It sounds older because the people making it were older. That's not a weakness. That's progression. So let's take a quick walk down Dave's memory lane and explore this a little further. The first Boston album is also part of my own record story. I bought it during that period when every record mattered because buying one required saving, choosing, and sometimes waiting. And that personal attachment is important, but it can also create a trap. When we connect that deeply with an early album, we sometimes reject everything that comes later simply because it cannot recreate the first experience. No later Boston album could be my first Boston album again. That doesn't mean those later albums had nothing to offer. The real test of my argument begins with Walk On. Brad Delp was not the lead singer on that studio album. Fran Cosmo stepped into a position that almost no singer could enter without being compared with one of rock's most recognizable voices. That comparison is understandable, but it can prevent us from hearing the record. I Need Your Love sounds unmistakably like Boston. The extended Walk On sequence shows Tom Scholz continuing to build music in movements rather than relying on conventional verse and chorus songs. Surrender to Me and Livin' For You give the record additional melodic weight. Do I miss Brad Delp on that album? Of course. But missing Brad Delp is not the same as Fran Cosmo singing badly. And Walk On is not a bad Boston album. Then we reach the album most likely to challenge my argument, Corporate America. It is more stylistically scattered. It expands beyond the version of Boston many listeners expected. Other voices and writers become more visible. The environmental message is direct, and the album does not always feel as unified as the earlier records. But it still contains I Had a Good Time, Someone, You Gave Up on Love, and the title track makes clear that Tom Scholz was still waiting to use Boston's platform to say something he considered important. This may be Boston's least consistent record, but least consistent is not the same as worthless. Finally, we have Life, Love, and Hope. This is a complicated album. It arrived after Brad Delp's death. It uses several singers. Some songs appeared in earlier forms, and the recording history stretches across years. That can make the album feel less like one captured moment and more like a project assembled across different periods. But listen to the guitar work, the harmonies, the emotional purpose behind the record, the title track, Heaven on Earth, The Way You Look Tonight. There is still care in the construction. There is still a desire to create that uplifting Boston sound. It may be an uneven farewell to the studio catalog, but I cannot call it a bad album. Boston's greatest achievement may also be the reason the later catalog receives so little patience. They established the standard too early. After the first album, good was no longer good enough. Very good was no longer good enough. Anything that was not another landmark could feel disappointing. But judged individually, the catalog tells a different story. There are masterpieces, strong follow-ups, mature returns, a successful reinvention, difficult experiment, and a complicated final chapter. Different levels of success. But no album I would call completely bad. So on tonight's Side One Spin, go back through your Boston catalog, whether on vinyl or CD or cassette or even just digital, and just listen to them in sequence. And come back and tell me what you think is Boston's weakest studio album. And here's the important second part. What's the best song on that album? Because it's easy to dismiss a record. It's more interesting to find the song that makes the record worth keeping. Tell me the album, the song, and your argument in the comments. Well, that's it for today's Side One. Thanks for spending a little time with me, and please keep that needle in the groove, and we will talk to you tomorrow about a Kansas album that arrived after a remarkable run of records. And it may have been punished simply because it was not the album that came before it. We'll talk to you tomorrow.